The commandant in Jerusalem, that is a Roman leader of the soldiers at the fortress of Antonia, was in big trouble. He had to figure out what to do with Paul. He did not really understand why he was accused and why the Jewish leaders were so mad at him. So he summoned the Jewish Sanhedrin in order to interrogate Paul. Technically speaking, the commandant had no right to summon the Sanhedrin, but in this case they probably were more than eager to arrive in order to get rid of Paul. The description of the encounter with the Sanhedrin falls into two parts. In the first part of chapter 23 of Acts, first Paul has a discussion, a somewhat impolite discussion, with the high priest Ananias. That is the Greek version of the Hebrew Hananiah. Let's read part of it. Here in chapter 23 it is said from verse 2, looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers," and I'm reading from English Revised Version, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck?" That's not the most diplomatic way of beginning an encounter with anyone. Now, a word about this Ananias. He was the leader of the Sadducees, cooperating with the Romans. He was known by all descriptions as a man of extreme greed. The Jewish historian Josephus describes him this way: he was a great hoarder up of money. By violence even he took away the tithe that belonged to the priest. When the Jewish rebellion took its beginning in 66 AD, the zealots very quickly got hold of Ananias and killed him. So Paul's words here seem to have a prophetic significance. Now, nevertheless, why did he become so angry with Paul? And here you have a few clues. When Paul says, "I have lived my life before God in all good conscience," he is telling, first of all, I, as a Christian, am a good Jew. That would, of course, in some way imply that those who did not follow Christ, like Ananias, were not good Jews. Next, of course, by saying, "I have good conscience," he, as the accused, turned the accusation. When you have two parties in a civil court case, if one is innocent, the other party is guilty. So Paul is, by stating his innocence, switching from being the accused to being the accuser. The encounter with Ananias continues. It doesn't get much better. Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was a high priest." I will stop there for a moment, because some people say, but is that because he didn't see that well? Now, it's evident from his previous quote that he actually was very well aware that Ananias was a high priest. So why is he saying it this way? And his explanation will lift the veil of that story. For it is written, "You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Now, Paul is actually saying, how could I know that he is a high priest if he behaves as if he is not? So, by title, yes, he was a high priest, but by action, by the way he acted, by his disrespect for law, the law of God, he was not. So that's an ironic way of pointing out the immoral character of Ananias. Now, we will leave that discussion with the Sanhedrin. There is another interesting episode taking place after the discussion, which is cut short because Paul manages to get the parties within the Sanhedrin to discuss between themselves, so they never get any clear response, and the commandant is still in trouble. He doesn't really understand what's going on. But what he figures out is that there are a group of Jews, 40 people, who swear an oath not to eat or drink anything until they have killed Paul. And they plan to lie in ambush for Paul, as he would be taken the next day to Caesarea and delivered to the governor, to Felix there, so that the commandant in Jerusalem can, let's say, send the ball on to the next. But Paul's nephew, his sister's son, somehow hears about this plot to kill Paul. We have no idea how. We have never heard about the nephew or Paul's sister before. They just mentioned Paul grew up in Jerusalem. He had family. There are so many interesting things we don't know about Paul. We may not even know his real Latin name, except for the last one, that is Paulus. But his praenomen and family name, we don't know. But we know he had some money. And he had a nephew who was only a teen. That is also evident from the description. The commandant takes him away, puts his arm around him, and he listens to him and understands this is for real. There are some people out to kill Paul, and the commandant takes measures to avoid that to happen. Some would say, and what happened to those 40 guys? Did they die of hunger or thirst? But there is a rule, or there was a rule in the Mishnah, that if you had given such a promise, if the circumstances prevented you from fulfill it, the obligation was left. So, yes, they all died. It's a long time ago, but they didn't die because they didn't drink or eat. So much is clear, at least. And then the commandant sends Paul off with what is called a demissoria littera, that is an official letter of sending, which would be given to, in this case, Felix in Caesarea, so that he could understand why he has received this prisoner. And when Paul arrives in Caesarea safely, he is, according to the last part of the chapter, he is at first asked by the governor what province he was from. When he learned, that is, the governor learned that Paul was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And Paul was then taken into custody until the accusers could arrive from Jerusalem. Why did he ask him where he came from? And that would have been for legal procedure. That is, he needed to know whether this was within his jurisdiction. And at this time, Cilicia and Judea both belonged to a jurisdiction with the headquarters in Syria, so the trial or the court could be set, and Felix had the authority to make that happen. And that will happen in chapter 24. Paul has now left Jerusalem, and he will not return to Jerusalem anymore in the book of Acts. Thank you for listening to Tidbits from Acts of the Apostles. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we will follow up and see what happens to Paul in Caesarea.